I'm moving forward every day, Jesus. I just let him lead the way every second, every minute, every hour of the day. I'm moving with Jesus every day. 24/7 with Jesus every day. 24/7.
It can be easy to forget that this country has not been around for very long. You go to other countries, European countries in particular, you can walk inside of buildings that were erected 1,000 years ago. Although Native Americans were already here, it's 1620 that we point to as really the genesis of this nation. It's the commonly held date that we appeal to. That's when a group of immigrants on board a ship called the Mayflower landed at Plymouth Rock, evidently. Have you been to Plymouth Rock? Have you seen? How many people have not physically been to and seen Plymouth Rock? Okay, most of us have not been. It's a long way from here. Don't let your hopes get up too high. I mean, the thing is not Ayers Rock. It's not the Rock of Gibraltar. There's not much left of it, frankly. It's wonderful. It's historic. But it's a wee bit disappointing when you actually see Plymouth Rock. About 30 miles in a straight line from Boston, Massachusetts. That's where the Pilgrims landed. It was 150 years, I might say only 150 years, before a collection of 13 colonies declared independence from Great Britain. Just 10 more years and the Declaration of Independence had been signed. And at that time, the United States was only a quarter of the size that it is today. President Thomas Jefferson in 1803 signed off on the Louisiana Purchase. It cost this country $27 million and doubled the size of the nation. So the nation was growing. 15 years later, the Mexican-American War ended. The United States gained all or some of Arizona, Colorado, California, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. So the nation was growing yet again. Washington and Oregon were then acquired by the United States. Interesting, you may or may not know this. Oregon was co-governed by Britain and the United States for a number of years, but then came into the fold. It cost the United States Vancouver Island in order to secure governing Oregon and Washington. Some would call that a fair deal, others maybe not, I don't know. And then before long, Seward's folly. What's that? Alaska. He bought Alaska, the United States bought Alaska at Seward's encouragement, I think it was 1867, for 2 cents an acre. Bought it from Russia. People said, well, that was a waste of time. I don't know that many people would be saying that today. Beautiful Alaska, resource-rich Alaska. What a fantastic place. And then before the 1800s were over, Hawaii had become the Hawaiian territory and eventually would become the 50th state of the United States of America. And so the country grew. It was growing. Where was it heading? What was going to happen? Fascinating story about a nation that actually began very small and arose to slowly become, ultimately, the world's global superpower. Some might say the world's sole superpower. Some have said that, but I don't know that we need to dicker about on terms. From humble beginnings to a position of global strength and might. Now, to ignore history and to pretend that every day was the good old days in the history of the United States would be wrong. It would be a mistake. In fact, it would be grossly inappropriate. It took this country an unfathomably long time to extricate itself, an unforgivably long time to extricate itself from the shackles of slavery. But when it did, all we ended up with was slavery by another name. Something that not nearly of you know much about is convict leasing. Google it, read about it, watch the It Is Written TV program about it. And then Jim Crow with injustice and indignity for decades and decades. So we don't want to forget that, and I would hope that nobody actually would. We rightly remember titans of the civil rights movement, people like Rosa Parks, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It is appropriate that we do. There were others, though. W.E.B. Du Bois. You see his name, you say, isn't it Du Bois? If you were to ask him, he would say Du Bois, and so out of respect, that's what we say. People like Bayard Rustin, another leader in the civil rights movement. Claudette Colvin. Why is she significant? 9 months before Rosa Parks, in December of, I think, 1955, it was March, and I think I had the year right, Claudette Colvin, without anyone prompting her, refused to give up her seat on a bus and was, of course, hauled off the bus and arrested. She went on to become a significant figure. And then there were others, including Dorothy Height, another leader in the civil rights movement, many, many more, helping this nation to progress past its errors, its blindness, its difficulties. At the time that these individuals were working, they could not go to a department store and try on clothes. Not you, wrong color. In order to buy a pair of shoes, it was common that African Americans would trace on a piece of paper around their foot and then go into a store, and if one that they could get into, hold it up to a shoe and say, well, this one looks like it might fit. I mean, I'm touching on the small stuff. It got a whole lot worse than that. But we got through. We're working our way through. Someone's going to say, we didn't get through. Well, listen, we've made progress. We're making progress. I'd like to give the nation the benefit of the doubt. We're moving on past the awful stuff of the past. Now, of course, we are not the only country that has had to wrestle with problems of the past on a grand scale, as societies have learned that they need to move past archaic and sometimes inhumane practices. But in spite of these challenges, in spite of the indignity and in spite of the injustice and in spite of the mistakes, and some of those weren't mistakes, they were frequently very intentionally committed. In spite of that, the United States ascended to a position of global greatness. You see, these United States have been an experiment. Here in this land, it was decreed for the first time that people were born with certain unalienable rights, God-given rights. Here, we believe that government ought to be by the people and for the people. After the Constitution was hammered out in Independence Hall in Philadelphia, very interesting. Benjamin Franklin told a person nearby, a woman, the woman said, "What has this gathering produced?" And Franklin said, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." Fascinating words. A republic, madam, if you can keep it. That's what these United States are. A constitutional federal republic. Constitutional because this nation's laws are based on the Constitution. The Constitution is the supreme law in the United States of America. Federal because we have both a national government and then a federation of 50 state governments. A republic because that's the form of government in which the people hold the power. We elect representatives so that they can exercise the power in our behalf. We have a government that was not based or is not based on a privileged class. Nobody inherits positions of rulership and leadership, and we don't have self-appointed rulers. We like to call those dictators. In the founding of this nation, it was determined, or it was recognized, that we have individual rights that derive from our Creator. We left the power with the people, except those powers that we delegated to the government. And in fact, we set it up in such a way that if those powers are abused, those powers can be recalled or taken back. When he was 81 years of age, Benjamin Franklin said, listen, this is prescient words, "When you assemble a number of men to have the advantage of their joint wisdom," when you pull a bunch of people together and collect their joint wisdom, you inevitably assemble with those men all their prejudices, their passions, their errors of opinion, their local interests, and their selfish views. Franklin stated unequivocally, no system of government can be perfect because people are not perfect. In 1776, 13 colonies with a combined population of about 2.5 million declared independence from the most powerful empire on the planet. And then they fought to defend that freedom. Now, what were the times like? There were no airlines in that time. There was no railroad, no television, no refrigeration. There was no electricity. There was no running water. There wasn't even running water at the White House until the year 1833. And yet, less than 200 years after the Constitution was signed, these United States put a man on the moon. And then, and impossible to imagine, 12 years later, the Space Shuttle Columbia took off on its maiden flight from the Kennedy Space Center. That's mind-boggling. 12 years after Neil Armstrong took one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind, the space shuttle went up and came back. The United States has spearheaded breathtaking industrial and technological developments, while at the same time defending religious liberty. What a great nation, in spite of its flaws. What a great nation. But can we expect any nation to get it right 100% of the time? The answer is obvious. We cannot. And this country has not, for various reasons. Ben Franklin mentioned them. Well, you pull a bunch of people together to rule and to glean from their wisdom, you end up having to deal with their prejudices and their passions and their errors of opinion and their local interests and their selfish views. That's how it goes. So we cannot expect any government to always get it right, even the government of the United States of America. I find it really interesting that a recent Gallup poll revealed that Americans' trust and confidence in themselves to make judgments, good judgments, under the democratic system is low. Let me say that again. The trust and confidence that Americans have in themselves to make good judgments under the democratic system is low, very low. Back in the 70s, that number was up over 80%. But from that time to this, the number has plunged. Isn't it interesting? One Gallup analyst said this. This is insightful. Let's take a look. He said that this could create a crisis for overall confidence in the United States democratic system. Okay, let me say that again. The reason being, Americans' confidence in themselves to make good judgments and decisions under democracy is at an all-time low. A Gallup analyst says this could create a crisis for overall confidence in the U.S. democratic system. I find that interesting. I wonder if you do. So we go to the Bible now and find out where the Bible introduces the United States of America. And the Bible does. America is right there. Now, the Bible speaks about many nations, different nations, for various reasons. For example, one geographical location we're introduced to, Garden of Eden, that's where Adam and Eve were. That's an obvious one. Mesopotamia, that's where Abraham was. God called Abraham out of Mesopotamia, out of Ur of the Chaldees. Southern Iraq is where Abraham was called from. And then you had the nations around about Israel. Israel is mentioned, of course. I barely need to mention that, but I will. That's where God's people were. The promised land, that's where they went. But then you had Egypt and Syria and Lebanon, and in the New Testament, Turkey. That's Asia Minor, and other places such as Greece and Italy mentioned in the Word of God. So where do we find the United States? Well, before we do that, let's go back. We'll go back to Daniel chapter 2. Remember, we've built a foundation. We're building on a foundation, and we want to make sure we don't step off that platform. It's important that we remain true to the guidance given to us in the Holy Bible. We see the rise and fall of nations in Daniel chapter 2. Babylon, Medo, Persia, Greece, Rome. Rome divides. Then Jesus returns and sweeps away the kingdom of the world. But you go to Daniel chapter 7, you see the Bible paints much the same picture. In Daniel chapter 7, we're introduced to Babylon. And why? Well, Babylon was that great, I want to say world-ruling nation, but you didn't get Babylon extending down to the South Pacific. The world as we understood it at that time as pertaining to the narrative of the Bible. This great power, Babylon, attacking Israel, Judah, taking captive many of the people, including the flower of the youth, subjugating Israel. Babylon ruled and had a direct impact on God's covenant people. After Babylon, Medo-Persia, which conquered Babylon and then reestablished Jewish society. It was Artaxerxes, the Medo-Persian ruler, who said to Nehemiah and others, off you go. You can go back. They even funded the journey, provided protection. Babylon and then Medo-Persia. Then there was Greece under Alexander the Great. After Greece came Rome. Jesus died on a Roman cross. Pontius Pilate was a Roman governor. Rome ruled and did so for well over 500, even 600 years, but then even Rome came to an end. So let's see this in Revelation chapter 13. We're building on this platform. We go to Revelation 13, verse 1, and it says, I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns. On his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. The beast which I saw was like unto a leopard. His feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. The dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. Verse 3, I saw one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed. And all the world marveled and followed the beast. Fascinating. So they worshiped the dragon who gave authority to the beast. And they worshiped the beast, saying, who is like the beast? Who is able to make war with him? We identified this nation last night. If you weren't here, I would encourage you to watch the archived presentation or get the study materials from last night and pore over them. It's of vital importance. The Bible speaks about an entity, a nation, in fact, in earth's last days, that would be spiritually destructive. It would appear to be okay. It would do much that is good, but it would be responsible for spiritual ruin. And to wander in this world without understanding who and what that is and how that might apply to you would be madness, in my opinion. But we covered that last night, and it became very clear. That's the first nation in Revelation chapter 13. But along comes another nation. We see it in verse 11, Revelation 13, 11. And I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spoke as a dragon. So how do you go about identifying this nation? Well, you look at the clues that God has given you right there, even on the screen or on the page, depending on where you are looking. We see that it came out of the earth. The first nation came up out of the sea. In Bible prophecy, sea represents multitudes of people, so you can expect then that the earth would represent an area of the world that is relatively uninhabited. Rather than coming out of an area where there were lots of people, it came out of a part of the world that was relatively uninhabited. Well, let's consider something. We need to remind ourselves what these symbols are all about. Keep something in mind. When John wrote the book of Revelation, he was writing profoundly important material, but he gave the keys to unlock the mysteries to his readers. I'll tell you why. He tied the New Testament book of Revelation to the Old Testament itself. That was the frame of reference for the New Testament reader. So as people were reading Revelation, they saw symbols, references there, and the way John crafted this, the reader was able to say, oh yeah, I understand just what you mean. For example, he wrote about something called Babylon. Now for the New Testament Christian, keep in mind, their scriptures were the Old Testament, by and large. almost exclusively. So as they read the Old Testament, they were familiar with the Old Testament, and Babylon. Well, we know what Babylon is. That's a pagan entity. And it deals in false worship. And it believes in the idea that people, when they die, they go on living. Life after death, spiritualism. Oh, we understand what you're talking about here. We get a really clear picture of what this entity Babylon is actually all about. So readers of the Bible in the first century were able to read John's book, and rather than scratch their head, they could say, we understand the concepts. We get what he's talking about because we're so familiar with them from the Old Testament, which is where John got the symbols from. John wrote Revelation to be understood through the lens of the Old Testament. And so in Revelation, you got seas representing multitudes of people. You've got wind representing strife and warfare. You've got women or a woman representing a church. And you've got a beast representing a nation. And how do we know that? It's really important because in Daniel chapter 7, God just goes ahead and spells it out. Verse 17 of Daniel 7, these great beasts which are four kingdoms that shall arise out of the earth. And then verse 23, thus he said, the fourth beast shall be the fourth kingdom upon the earth. So it's fascinating today, and I do want to be respectful, that you'll find many Christians will say a beast, well, that's Ronald Reagan, or that's King Juan Carlos, or that's some dictator here, or some teacher there. But that's not how God ever intended that. A beast represents a nation. We do the same thing today with sports teams. Sports teams are named after bears and tigers and lions and dolphins and whatever, by and large. We do it with nations. When I mention nations and I say eagle, well, you automatically think United States of America. Lion, that would be Great Britain. Bear, that's Russia. A kiwi bird, that's the symbol representing New Zealand, where I'm from. So we do animals representing nations even today. God was doing that thousands of years ago. So the nation in Revelation chapter 13 would come up in a part of the world that was relatively sparsely populated. But when would it come up? Where do you look for this entity, Revelation 13:11, in the stream of time? Well, it had to have been relatively recent. How do we know that? Because it came up after the four nations, Babylon, Medo, Persia, Greece, and Rome. After those nations divided, that happened, or after Rome divided, that was 476 AD. And then it would rise after the little horn. If you look in Daniel, you look in Revelation, the little horn is waning in power as this other nation is waxing greater. You know that it's a new nation, not an old nation. You know it's a new nation. We want to keep that in mind. A new nation depicted in the world. Then how did it come up? Revelation 13 verse 11 says, I saw another beast coming up out of the earth. He had two horns like a lamb, spoke as a dragon, two horns like a lamb. In Revelation, lamb, symbol representing Jesus, almost every time it's employed. There's one time the word lamb doesn't represent Jesus. All the others it does. So somehow this second nation is going to be lamb-like or Christ-like somehow. We don't need to define that to the nth degree right now, but it's lamb-like, which can only mean it's Christ-like. There'll be some things about it that people will find appealing and attractive, maybe some great strengths, maybe some real ideals that it holds that you would say, well, these are in harmony with God's way of thinking. And I want you to notice that on this nation, there's no crown. The first nation had crowns on its heads. This one does not. A crown denotes a monarch or a monarchy. This second nation, there's no crown. Therefore, there cannot be a monarch or a monarchy. That's important to mention. So here's what we know. We know it came up in a sparsely populated area of the earth. We also know it's a young nation. There's no monarchy, and then it assumes a position of worldwide power and influence. There's only one nation on the planet that could possibly be the second nation in Revelation chapter 13, and that's the United States of America. When it arose, it was known as the New World. It was a haven for those escaping religious persecution. It was founded on the twin freedoms, freedom of government and freedom of religion. But according to what we've read in the Bible, a change comes over this nation, which means there has to be a change at the heart of this nation. Now, how do we know that? Look at verse 11 again. It's interesting. And I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth. He had two horns like a lamb, but notice this, spoke as a dragon. Now, you don't need to spend too long trying to figure out what that dragon represents. In the book of Revelation, the dragon again and again represents the devil. That seems strange, doesn't it? That this lamb-like nation would in some way speak like a dragon. How does a nation speak? Well, a nation speaks through its laws, through its legislative assembly. So that's interesting. It sounds very much from what we read that there has to be a change at the heart of this nation expressed through its laws. Notice verse 12. Verse 12 says, he, the second nation, exercises all the authority of the first beast or first nation in his presence, and causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast whose deadly wound was healed. According to what we read in the Bible, the second nation will use its power and its influence to elevate the first nation and to cause the world to follow after that first nation, the beast of Bible prophecy. That's what we read. I want to say this. People like me have been teaching this for close to 200 years, this very scenario. When people first started teaching this, the United States was a tiny nation, hardly populated. It didn't seem likely. But people started teaching this based on what they found in the Word of God. What's really interesting is that the couple of hundred years, a little less, that this has been taught, have not in any way undermined or weakened this biblical position. In fact, the advance of time has proved that this is more likely and not less likely. You understand what I'm saying? You might scratch your head. You might say, well, man, I'm not sure about that. But I will tell you that since this idea was first put out there, it has become more likely and not less likely, more believable and not less believable. And I'll tell you why. Because it's the truth of the Word of God, which only becomes more believable and doesn't become less believable. So how is it that that second nation might use its power and influence to cause the world to follow after and to perhaps even obey the dictates of the first nation? Let's see if we can understand that somehow. With freedom, there comes responsibility. In this country, you are free to learn how to fly a plane. If you can pay the money, meet some minimum requirements, I don't know, maybe it has to do with health and eyesight and so forth. If you can do that, we'll teach you how to fly a plane. Just like that. You are free to fly a plane. Now, with that, there comes the responsibility. We expect you to fly that plane responsibly. Don't go flying it into a building. Understand what I'm saying? In this nation, depending on where you live, you're free to own a gun, firearms, Second Amendment, you're free. But the hope is that you will discharge that freedom with responsibility. You won't use it in destructive ways. You're free to drive a car, drive sensibly. Don't harm anyone, don't harm yourself, don't kill people, don't do anything crazy. With freedom comes responsibility. With that responsibility comes the very real possibility that an individual might choose to use that freedom in an inappropriate or irresponsible way, a negative way. Has that ever happened in the United States? Where people use their freedom in a way that freedom wasn't designed to be used? Of course, we see it every day. Now, what you hear is this. It's pretty easy to look at what's going on in the United States of America and say, well, this is not my father's or my grandfather's or my great-grandfather's nation. While we've made great advances in some areas, man, things are falling apart in others. That's the easy part. The more difficult part is, what do we do about that? How do you address that? How do you turn the ship around? How do you right the listing vessel? How do you do that? That's the challenge. Many people see the only hope for the United States of America as being a return to the principles of the one who made this nation great, and that one was God. I say undeniably was God. Proverbs 14:34 says that righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. Can you imagine some country somewhere turning to God as the solution for its problems? You can imagine that. Of course you can. In recent times in this country, we have seen civil unrest. We've seen devastating wildfires burn out of control, burn for months and months and months on end. We have an economy that nobody thinks is in good shape. Do you know the size of the national debt right now? Can you tell me? It's around $30 trillion. Do you know how much money that is? No, I didn't think so. No one does. It's an enormous amount of money. So you can't look at that rationally and say, from an economic perspective, things look bright for this country. There's got to be, the only way out of that, who knows what the way out of that is? So economically, we're in a place that we have never, ever been before. We have supply chain issues, massive labor problems right now. Now we're confronting inflation that is as high as it has been in decades. Perhaps just that on its own, or we've been there before, but we're putting these things together now. Soaring fuel prices. We are struggling with a whole clutch of social issues. We have mass killings. You know, there hasn't been one for a while. There hasn't been a mass shooting for a while. What does that mean? It means there's going to be one soon. That's just how things go. It's like clockwork almost. We're clearly becoming polarized religiously and socially as a society. Very clearly. Oh, by the way, there's a pandemic raging that's still killing people from sea to shining sea. Thank God numbers are down. Where I live, the amount of new COVID cases has plunged 95% in 3 weeks. That's wonderful. If you look at the numbers for Multnomah County, they're in free fall. That's really good. I'm not making any comment. I'm simply saying, thank the Lord, things are turning around. We're really glad to see that. But the fact is, people are still dying here, there, and everywhere. It's interesting that we got to figure out how to wrestle with this, but let me ask you a question. What if things actually got really bad? John, haven't you said already that things are really bad? Nah, not really. They're bad. But can you imagine if things got really bad? And I don't say that with any disrespect to those who've been negatively impacted in the last days, weeks, and months. But think about 9/11. After 9/11, what happened? The next weekend, the churches were packed.